Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I welcome you to our first program for the season. And Bill McAuliffee, who was going to take you back in time to the time when we traveled by trolley. So Bill, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Many thanks to the Historical Society for inviting me tonight. The reason I'm here is because we have such a fine barber shop. Both Frank and Leo have done a good job on my upper precincts, but I entrusted them with a really important job not long ago because I'm fortunate enough to have two little great-grandpersons. But I also have a house full of ladies. And they got into the worst argument you ever heard about when little Justin's hair should be cut for the first time. And I got into this Donnybrook because the first thing they did was to rule out the daddy. He wasn't qualified to take little Justin to the barber. The old bald-headed, gray-haired guy had to pick out the barber. But I already had Frank and Leo, and the day that I took them there, I brought a toy with me. I had already made an agreement with Frank that if he started to cry or he fidgeted in the barber chair too much, that we'd quit. Just whatever was cut or was uncut, we'd leave it, because this little guy was then 19 months old, and we were not going to force anything on him. So I want you to know that this gentleman here, put him in the chair, put the cape on him. He loved every second of it. He's got a beautiful haircut. I went home, and all my ladies were pleased with me. So you see, I have a very high opinion of that barbershop. Now, ladies and gentlemen, tonight what I want to do, particularly I'm pleased to look around here and see gray hair and people of roughly my vintage. To talk to you about the trolleys is really a rather fascinating subject. And a good way to do it is to take you back to the year 1910, shortly before the outbreak of World War I, when the trolley was a new technology. It was a hot stock like the electronics stocks are today. Brokers tried to sell investments in the street railways to their clients. And I want to focus on what actually existed here in Mamaroneck. This is the Mamaroneck Historical Society, so I want to focus on the immediate situation here, but I'm going to take the liberty of going way out in left field from time to time. Because in the year 1920, 10 years after what I'm focusing on, there were over 20,000 miles of operating trolley systems in this country, and they ranged from areas like the greater New York area, which was largely built up, to the Midwest where I grew up, where the trolley ran from a little town through a cornfield, tried to avoid hitting the cows along the route, and went into the next little town. And in all of these situations, the trolley was very important. Certainly the automobile made a major later contribution to the development of the suburbs, but the initial opening up of the suburbs, Mamaroneck and all its sister towns around here on the Long Island shore, owed a very great deal to the trolley, which I'll try to show you tonight. Now also, I think there are a great many people in this room who remember the trolleys and rode the trolleys, but so everyone can have a comparable picture, I'm going to try to go over basics of things like the tracks, the voltages in the wires, what the cars were, and what the service was. One of the interesting things to think about is the way this technology has vanished here. There are very few remnants of the trolley or the era of the trolley. It's hard to find something that you can look at and say, gee, that reminds me of when the trolley ran here. So I'm going to discuss that abandoned technology. You have to search for clues to see how the street railways ran around here. Mamaroneck in 1910 was an optimistic place. Going from the street railways to the heavier weight electric railways, you had the New York, New Haven, and Hartford operating what is today Metro North. But buying real estate literally cheek by jowl, running out as far as Portchester, was the New York, Westchester, and Boston. the people who promoted what came to be known as the Westchester had the very highest ideals. They bought the best electric railway cars, they had the best people laying track and building stations, and they really did mean to go back in those days from Port Chester to Boston. They thought they'd operate successfully and do that. As we all know, the Westchester lasted from 1910 to 1935. There's still highly valuable property in Scarsdale which cannot be sold. You cannot convey a fee title to the property because the bondholders and the bankruptcy folks had such a knockdown, drag-out fight when the Westchester gave up in 1935 and in the years thereafter when they tried to sort out its business. Here in Mamaroneck, you had the Westchester about to begin service, the New Haven as the through commuter railroad out from Grand Central, and you had this new technology, the trolley. Now, how did railroad men in general envision this mix? They envisioned that you'd pay 35 to 50 cents to come out to the suburbs from Grand Central, wherever you were going. But for a nickel, you got off the trolley at a given station. You got off the railroad at a given station, and you got on the trolley. And the trolley was your taxi cab. It was your station wagon. It took you closer to the actual house that you were headed for. Now, out of New Rochelle, which had quite a complex of trolley facilities, including terminals, there were tracks on the Post Road and Halstead Avenue. Now, we live in an age when you can get a ticket from a policeman if you drive over the double line in the middle of the street 6 inches or a foot. Back in those days, much of Halstead, much of the Post Road was not paved. And the rules of the game for riding a horse, riding a mule, or driving a horseless carriage were a little more rough and ready. Because the trolley company had the tracks right down the middle of the street, it could operate cars in either direction on that track. And you had to be mighty alert to what was coming at you or passing you by way of a streetcar back in those days. The tracks came out past the nurseries on the Post Road as far as where the Washington Mutual Bank is, down at the corner of the Post Road and Mamaroneck, and they turned left to come up Mamaroneck Avenue. As soon as the tracks curved up Mamaroneck Avenue, there was a switch. And believe it or not, because there's no evidence of this left, there was a causeway from the Long Island Sound side of such paving of the Post Road as existed, out over the water to Harbor Island. And on that causeway, from that switch right at the corner of Mamaroneck and the Post Road, there was a trolley siding, what we would call a siding. Now, why on earth would you run a trolley track right out into the water to Harbor Island? Because another means of transportation was still in existence back in those days, namely the steamboats, some of them side-wheeler paddle wheelers that traveled all up and down Long Island Sound. You could get on a steamboat and go to New London or New Haven, not New Haven, various other ports, you know, such as New London, along Long Island Sound. And that trolley met the steamboat and conveyed people to local destinations from its landing point. Now, the trolley went single track up to where the Sound Federal Bank is at the intersection of Palmer Avenue and Mamaroneck. And believe it or not, there was a hotel on that corner back in those days. And the trolley track also coming out from New Rochelle on Halstead Avenue, on Palmer Avenue, curved onto Mamaroneck Avenue there, and there was almost immediately another switch there. And just beyond, what is the name of that, Spencer Place there? The first street east of coming from the railroad. The trolley went right over the sidewalk, and it had its own little terminal where the shoe store is there on the corner. Now, the next property was either owned or leased by the trolley company, and you could board the trolley there in a sort of a little local terminal. The track curved, the building lots of that block coming this way from Halstead Avenue were a given depth, and right behind them the trolley company had an easement to go up to Halstead And of course, where it bent right there, it was right at the Mamaroneck, the New Haven Railroad Station, and it went on out east on Halstead, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, the track, I said it was a siding there. It also went straight ahead under the railroad and on out Mamaroneck Avenue. Now, if you try to operate a trolley going this way on a single track, and you have service coming the other way on a single track, you better make some kind of provision, or you've got big trouble. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with Warren Avenue out on Mamaroneck Avenue beyond where I-95 is now, just before Mamaroneck Avenue makes its big S-curve around the reservoir and the water station there. At Warren Avenue, in the block, half a block either way from the intersection of Warren and Mamaroneck, they had what was called a passing track. Now, a passing track was what its name implies, a place where a trolley going in one direction could meet a trolley going in another direction. So you had the trolley running on Mamaroneck Avenue, you had a switch here, and a length of track longer than any piece of equipment they had in service on that line, and then it went back here. And this is what the motorman called a meet. The trolley coming down from White Plains had to be here, and if the guy coming out from Mamaroneck was a little bit early, he had to stop here and wait until this guy showed up. Now, the dispatchers and the supervisors of trolley lines back in those days attempted to enforce timely execution of these meets. They didn't want one car sitting there for 10 or 15 minutes because the other guy was late. So they had a rudimentary telephone system. One of the telephone poles supporting the trolley wires would have a phone box on it, so that if a given trolley was late, the motorman on the car that was waiting could call up the dispatcher and complain. Now, there wasn't a darn thing the dispatcher could do to make the oncoming car pick up and get on time, but rudimentary systems of communication such as this developed with these trolley systems as they themselves developed. Now, I should say that I'm not going to talk to you tonight about horse car lines, about a mule pulling a box of people down the street before there was electrification. In general, the story of Westchester County is that it was thought of as an outer suburb as far as transportation went, the way we think of, say, Putnam County, somebody moving up to Putnam County to get away from it all. Mamaroneck was something of an outer suburb. And for that reason, there wasn't much horse car development in this area. Electrification came along in the middle of the 1890s. It was greatly enhanced by a guy named Frank Sprague. Frank Sprague was an electrical engineer who proved in the city of Richmond, Virginia, that you could have an operating system of numerous trolleys on one power grid of trolley lines, and they could all stop at once, and they could all start up their motors again simultaneously without causing an oversurge of electricity that would, short circuit the whole system and shut it down. There were technical developments in the fields of electrical engineering in the mid-1890s which made the development of the trolley possible. They grew up not unlike the community antenna television systems out in Pennsylvania at the dawn of the age of television. They met local needs. If you think about the old television antenna with the rods on it that you used to pick up your airwave television signal on before there was any cable or 6 channels, the people out in the coal mining country of Pennsylvania had hills and dales, steep hills and dales, which meant that the antenna on the top of a house didn't pick up television signal very well. And to meet the need of correcting poor reception, a guy would climb the highest hill locally and he'd build an antenna. And that was called the community antenna. And for a fee, he'd hook up you folks down in the valley so your reception would improve. And the development of the trolley was very much similar to that here in Westchester County. People needed to get from here to there, and on a very ad hoc basis, people said, let's lay a track from here to there so people can get from here to there. In the very early days of electrification, somebody decided there was a need to go from White Plains to Tarrytown, and one of the oldest lines in Westchester was laid out Tarrytown Road. Mount Vernon was an adjunct to the Bronx. There was extensive development of the trolley in the 5 boroughs, and very early on, Mount Vernon became a center of travel north to White Plains, east to New Rochelle and Mamaroneck and beyond, and the trolley grew up very naturally, step by step, to meet these needs. Now, the trolley companies had to go to the local political figures. What did they ask for? They asked for a franchise to operate down the middle of Main Street. They asked to be able to turn here. They laid out on maps a plot for their tracks. Now, what was the concern of the local politicians who made it possible for the trolleys to operate? Initially, they used the word electrolysis. I think ladies used electrolysis for beauty. Back in those days, electrolysis was a mysterious term, as little understood as what electricity is. We don't know today. We don't have a really good working definition. But people feared the proposition that you were going to put a trolley down the main street with a trolley wire, which in most cases, most systems, was 500 volts of direct current. That electrical circuit had to be grounded, and in most systems, they grounded. That is, they welded connector wires to one rail of the track so that you had the power source was the overhead trolley wire, which hopefully didn't cause harms to humans or animals because it was up in the air. But you had the track grounded. And in some mysterious way, you had this concept of the grounding of electricity, which people didn't understand, and therefore they were afraid of it. Out in Cincinnati, Ohio, a city of 500,000 people, even in the early years of this century, they absolutely were afraid of electrolysis. And they said, we ain't going to let you pollute our water pipes, scare our children, kill our dogs, the way Con Ed is killing dogs in Greenwich Village today. We are not going to allow you to have a grounded circuit that has anything to do with a track in the ground. So if you went out to Cincinnati when they had trolleys, all the trolley cars had 2 poles, and they ran around with 2 trolley wires running down the street instead of 1. One drew the power into the car to run its motors, and the other was the grounding circuit. These were the kind of problems that the trolleys had in their early years. People promoted trolley lines the way some guy, your brother-in-law, is telling you about a hot technology stock today. The trolley lines had a hard time raising money. Many of them were built on a shoestring. The ones that ran on private right-of-way and perilous traffic conditions never had adequate block signals or other things that you associate with a conventional railroad. They raised money, they prospered briefly. The automobile and the jitney bus and the regular bus came along and drove the technology out of existence. But there was a wave of consolidation. And I think it was Bill was kind enough to lend me this booklet of pictures of red and cream trolleys, which bore the legend on the side of them, Third Avenue Railway System, TARS, referring to Third Avenue in Manhattan, New York City. By a convoluted process of consolidations, the trolleys that ran through Mamaroneck at the time of the abandonment of trolley service were owned by the Third Avenue Railway System of Manhattan, and all the other trolleys in Westchester County were similarly consolidated in that one entity. By the time consolidation had gone that far, they were in money trouble. The buses were putting them out of business, and that was the story of the decline of the trolleys. But to give you an idea, this is a Third Avenue trolley operating in New York City. You'll notice it has no overhead wire. It has a slot in the street between the rails, and that again was a condition imposed on trolleys by New York City. A more common appearing trolley that operated up in this part of the country would look like this car here. In the early years of trolley operation, there were no air conditioning units in anybody's house. And on a hot summer day, a wonderful form of recreation was to board a trolley, which was called a summer car. I'm trying to find a picture here to show you an open car. Instead of having sides, it had removable sections, so you could use it during the winter. You could put vertical sides back on it, but in the summertime, you could take the sides off, and you could take a ride, say, up to Greenwich, Connecticut, from Mamaroneck on a hot summer day with humidity at 100%, and that breeze wafting through that car as you rode along in the rural precincts of Greenwich, Connecticut was pretty nice. You could ride from Mamaroneck up to Greenwich and have a cup of sassafras tea and ride back home with your best girl and think that you had had a pretty nice Saturday afternoon. And by the way, to bring a note of romance into the trolley, the trolleys that were open like this had a running board. And the running board was meant to accommodate people, sort of like you see pictures of a European train, that people could jump on between these verticals, where of course there were seats. You'd jump up on the running board and then move quickly into a seat, and it was more comfortable than entering the car by the front of the rear or walking down an aisle. Ladies back at the turn of the century wore high-button shoes. Ladies' skirt lengths were about like so. So all the young single fellas wearing their straw hats on a hot summer day, and believe me, I've got pictures to document this, they rode the trolley because if a young lady jumped as a pedestrian onto that running board, you got to see an ankle. And that was living. So anybody who doubts the romance of the trolley need only look at these facts. Now, let me shift into nuts and bolts. If you go over, and God forbid you do it, don't get too near Metro North, but a Metro North rail is about, give or take, like so. And of course, this, as a matter of physics, a railroad rail looks like this. It's a flanged rail, and it rides, as I say, this is a cross-section of a rail. The street railways use slightly lighter weight rails. They got their franchises from the local politicians. And an issue that eventually became a major issue for the economics of the street railway was paving. Here's the gutter and the edge of the road, paved by the local politicos or not paved. But when they granted franchises to the trolley lines to operate, one of them got the idea and the others took it up. Impose on the street railways the obligation to pave between the rails. Now, you could argue that a lot of different ways. They occasionally had to replace rails. They occasionally wanted to put in a new line, which would involve laying a new switch. So there was a great deal of logic to this. But when the trolley companies got in trouble, when the jitney bus and the automobile started to put them out of business, this became a matter of very great contention. Now, I'm assuming there's a lot of people here tonight who remember riding the trolleys. And I want you to think back to those days when paving of streets was not as good as it was now, where you occasionally saw a conscientious trolley company. This might be a mess. This might be beautiful paving blocks, those beautiful big old gray blocks, or they have, some of them used yellow brick. They often did a better job of paving than the local government. Now, that had consequences in the early days when your grandfather was driving around the Model A Ford Flivver. The first trolley out of the car barn after some of these snows like we've had the last 5 or 6 weeks was the snowplow car. And that snowplow car created a pathway on the public streets that was as good for the automobiles as it was for the trolley. And the trolleys performed an enormous public service, making it possible back in those earlier days of much lighter automobiles that skidded a lot more readily, the snow plowing function of the street railways was important to the moving of early motor traffic. Now, a trolley evolved, obviously. Before you had trolley cars, John Wayne movies, you had stagecoaches. And a stagecoach basically had an uncomfortable seat here and an uncomfortable seat leading backwards and a narrow door and a little hook wire of a step. And that was how you got in and out. The teamsters driving the horses were up there. If the stagecoach was operating out in Nevada, the Indians shot the arrows at these guys up here who were an easy target. The snow and the rain came down on these guys. Now, with the evolution of a horse car, what we could loosely call a trolley, you still had to have the predecessor of a motorman, namely a teamster, with control of reins to the horses. He had to hold those reins, and therefore he was on an open platform. So you see, the trolley got into labor management relations because once electrification came in, those teamsters, who were now called motormen, said, hey, why should I be out there in the elements? And so what you had was the closing in of the motorman's area to keep him out of the cold and the wet. And that evolved the shape of the modern streetcar with the motorman in here. Now, you had single-end trolleys, what we call single-ended trolleys. I don't know of any that operated around Mamaroneck. Well, I'm sure none operated in Mamaroneck, but not even in Westchester County. Your basic streetcar had what we call a clerestory roof. It had a little 8-10-inch high roof with windows in it just for comfort to let light into the car. It had a trolley pole with a roller on each end of the car, which came down to a spring-loaded rope controller. Now, notice I took my chalk and I made 2 marks here. The trolley had heavy coil springs. Those springs pulled this way on 2 bars set into the trolley pole. And of course, you remember your physics. If this is pulling like this, and there's a couple of studs here, the trolley pole will arc upward and make firm contact with the wire. Now, this trolley I brought here is a European trolley. You'd see a trolley like this in Moscow or Vienna, Austria in particular. They have more like what you see on Metro North as a pantograph, a wide bearing service. But the American trolley companies favored a trolley pole that came up and had a harp with a wheel that was not unlike your grandmother's clothesline wheel. The electric power was wires, it slid along the wire, it had jaws, and it rotated and drew the power down through the roof of the trolley to the motors. Teenage boys of adventurous bent used to love to get a trolley when it was stopped for an early traffic light or stopped otherwise stalled, grab this rope and pull the trolley off the wire. That was an early form of teenage creative activity. As the streets became more traffic laden with, you had farmers in from the country with a horse-drawn wagon, you had early automobiles breaking down, there were all sorts of things that would break down on the track in front of a streetcar and slow it down. And people always were complaining about the street railway companies for reasons like that. But this business of the rails in cities led the trolley companies to develop a different sort of steel rail. It had a bearing surface, which is what we all think of as a rail, but the flanged wheel of the trolley had a cup under it so that they could neatly pave from track to track. Now here in Westchester, the whole trolley scene, throughout the age of the trolley in Westchester, you had the first generation of trolley cars. After the Depression hit in 1929, the trolley companies were in trouble, quite a few of them were bankrupt. They tried to fight back as a technology. I'll talk about what they tried to do later, but I want to say to you that the cars that operated here, right up to the ones that lasted till after World War II in New Rochelle, were really pretty old technology. However, this kind of advance did creep in, and this rail was very expensive to buy, but the street railways did invest in it. The trolley companies had a switch. Trolley is coming down Mamaroneck Avenue, and it's either going to go up to White Plains or it's going to go out on the switch through this trolley terminal I told you about and then go on out Halstead Avenue to Harrison and beyond. The way they built a switch, this rail was continuous and this rail was continuous. Right here, meeting by turning this rail or by going here, it was a little bit longer. This portion of the rail, especially where it met this curving rail, was like a blade. It was sharp, not as sharp as a steak knife, but it whittled down to almost nothing. And what that enabled them to do, initially, the motorman had an iron crowbar with a flat panel on it like that, and he dropped the crowbar down and he could flip this moving piece of rail to cause the trolley to go up the switch or to go straight. They figured out later, since the trolleys were grounded through one rail of the system, that they could put a shock down in this rail without short-circuiting the motors, and they used to throw this section by magnetism. That's why some of you remember the trolley, you'll say to me, hey, Bill, I don't remember them taking a bar every time they wanted to go to a switch. No. They had the ability to push a button, throw magnetism into that moving piece of the switch, and go either straight ahead or, you know, change the switch from its prior setting. Those of you who would like to see trolleys that ran in Mamaroneck, trolleys like this, trolleys like these, the 3rd Avenue Railway system always favored big panels on the front of the car. They would always have, where this has got 3 dots, a great big panel, removable pieces of tin. And those pieces of tin had great big letters on them. They were on the Westchester cars, they were about this wide and about this high, and they'd have an A or an X or a Q or an R. And if you were a Westchesterite and you knew your way around, you knew by the letter on the car where it was going. The trolley rumbling down the street was quite a few tons of steel coming at you. Around here in Westchester, they were fairly content to use bars like this so that you're trying to cross the street on a snowy day and you slip on the rail and you fall down right on the track, and here's a trolley bearing down on you. They relied on something like this to push you out of the way. In other cities, trolley lines took steps that gave rise to the word cowcatcher. A cowcatcher on the front of a trolley, particularly out in the Midwest where the trolleys ran between cities, had a couple of braces somehow coming down like this, and it had some wire mesh here, but it mainly literally had a basket. You can see pictures of old trolley, and the idea was that if you fell down on the track, this would scoop you up like you were a snowball in front of a snowplow and throw you from your prone position here into the basket. It didn't work too well. If you got hit by a trolley, you probably wound up suing the trolley company. But they tried. See, these were the issues of safety that were presented to them. Now, let's go back again, as I say, to 1910. You are drinking a nice cold beer in a saloon on Mamaroneck Avenue. If you read E.L. Doctorow's National Book Club award-winning novel, Ragtime, you will find in there the story of a man and his little boy. The man had a dream. He wanted to create a penny machine for arcades that you could crank. And by hiring artists and creating a whole set of pictures, you would look into the viewfinder of this machine that you had paid a penny to look at, and it would show you a moving picture. And the picture moved because he had 300 drawings of the same thing. You know, gradually, you know, somebody going like this to move. He felt, because he lived in the teeming tenements of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that he had no future there. Opportunity for artists creating moving picture machines to run for a penny a try in an arcade, he thought had a better chance of getting ahead in Boston than they did in New York. So he took his little son and he packed his suitcase and he packed his own suitcase. He went out in the street there on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and he and the boy each paid a nickel, and they got on a trolley which took them up through Manhattan. They got a transfer. Trolley took them up through the Bronx so that they eventually wound up on Webster Avenue in the Bronx on the Yonkers side of the tracks. They got up above Our Lady of Mercy Hospital, 233rd there. The trolley kept going, and they got to Yonkers Avenue, where the trolleys came. Trolleys went all the way up Broadway. They went all the way to Tarrytown. But they got off the trolley right west of what is presently the Mount Vernon West Metro North Station. Now, at different times, that which we know of as Yonkers Avenue, Lincoln Avenue, the trolley wasn't actually connected. So they had to get off the trolley, carry their suitcases over the bridge that was there then, over the Class 1 railroad track, pay another nickel, get on a trolley that went through Mount Vernon, came down by South Fulton onto Sanford Boulevard, ran past Pelham High School, turned down Pelhamdale Avenue, came out on the Post Road, and went to New Rochelle. In New Rochelle, you had a really elaborate terminal. You had a terminal that had a small storage yard. Now, we all think of the local school bus companies. When school ends in June, they charter the school buses to churches, they charter them to camp groups, etc. The trolley companies were no fools. They realized that they had the poor man's vacation. They had the poor man's way to get out of New York City. This guy and his little son with their suitcases rode a trolley all the way into New Rochelle, where most of the time they could get a trolley of the Connecticut Railway Company. They could get on that trolley in New Rochelle, enjoy their ride in the summertime with the open sides off, through Greenwich to Stamford. In Stamford, they could get a trolley to Hartford. In Hartford, they could get a trolley to Worcester, Massachusetts. In Worcester, Massachusetts, they could get on a high-speed interurban of the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway, which took them right into Boston. Manhattan to Boston, fare total, $1.75, a nickel and a dime at a time. Now, this was only possible for a few years, immediately prior to and around the time of the outbreak of World War I. But if you read Dr. Rowe's novel, Ragtime, which was made into a hit movie, you'll read a fictionalized description of taking this kind of a trolley ride. Somebody was talking to me before the lecture started tonight about how much of a reality was this poor man's vacation. And I will tell you, those of you, for example, are members of AAA, you go into AAA, you're going to take a vacation to Upper New England, you get a AAA tour book. It was possible in 1910, 1912, 1914 to get a trolley vacations brochure. It told you where the good boarding houses and hotels were going out from New Rochelle to Mamaroneck into Greenwich into Stamford. And indeed, right over on the corner of Palmer Avenue there where the Sound Federal is, there was a hotel on that corner of Palmer and Mamaroneck, and it did get some of this trolley vacationer business. Now, I said that I would at times branch away from what was strictly possible here in Mamaroneck, and I'd like to do that now. They had a program on Channel 13 that was very successful. It was a history of technology, and the host and speaker took things that seemingly had nothing to do with one another and related them to the development of technology. So I say to all of you, what on earth does a cow have to do with a streetcar? If there are any electrical engineers here, you'll know that was not an insuperable problem. The trolley companies began to sell power to the farmers. The trolley companies, not being born yesterday, said, hey, if we're going to sell power to the farmers so they can milk all these cows and they've got all this milk, why should the first car out of the car barn have nothing but seats and be a passenger car? Let's cut it in half. So they took the trolley and they cut it in half. And half of the seats were for all the printers and policemen and other people who had to ride the trolley early in the morning back in those days to get to work. But the other half of the car was a boxcar. And I kid you not, these trolleys, which wove all through the farms, used to pull up alongside the farmer's barbed wire fence. And the top of the barbed wire fence, the farmer would have a little platform, and on that platform would be all the cans of milk that his electric milking machine had produced that morning. And what did the traction companies invest in themselves? They were always looking for investments to lay rail and have power. What did the trolley companies buy? They bought the creameries. You go out in the Midwest and look at your average creamery that's been in business for 100 years, and you'll find at some point or another, if it was near a power grid that could serve the farmers when electric milking came in, the trolley companies had an interest in it. And that's why you'll find back in the age of the heyday of the trolleys in the Midwest that ran between cities, they didn't have the name Indianapolis, Columbus, and Eastern Railway. They'd have a name like Public Service Company of Indiana or Public Service Power Light Railway and Heat. They'd have these big, long corporate names because they wanted to describe what they were doing. They were transporting people on trolleys. They were selling power to farmers and beginning rural electrification. 30 years before the Tennessee Valley was a national political issue, the trolley companies, bit by bit, were electrifying the farms. And especially, you talk about women's liberation, they improved the lot of women on a farm beyond belief. Now, my own dad described these things to me and some of the ridiculous things that went on. In Springfield, Ohio, when the light bulb came in, they had a light bulb quota, and they had a city ordinance. You had a light bulb on your porch outside. That was for security, etc. And you were allowed to have a light bulb in your living room. And when a light bulb burned out, you had to wait till you got your bill from the electric company, and you took the burned out light bulb and your bill downtown, riding a trolley to get there, of course, and you went into the power company office and you paid your light bill, and you turned in your burned out light bulb, and you got a new one. Now, that did not last very long. That's a very short chapter in American history. Obviously, the mass production came to light bulbs. But there was a time when that was how people lived. Now, I want to talk about racetracks and amusement parks, because this absolutely affects the way trolley service existed here in Mamaroneck. Most people, and I'm amazed how many people think that Rye Playland was this amazing planned amusement park that sprung up in the 1920s, and they've written histories of Rye Playland, and they don't say a word about what was there the day that somebody thought up Rye Playland. Let me assure you that there was a place in 1910 on the site of the present Playland called Rye Beach Park. Rye Beach Park had a hotel, it had an immense theater, it had picnic grounds and what you would think of in an amusement park. Now, trolley companies loved amusement parks. They loved racetracks, because especially Saturday, Sunday, and holidays, you could get masses of people who didn't have anything better to do to pay their nickel and go out and have some fun. The trolley companies were always crucially interested in forms of popular amusement that involve large crowds of people moving from the urban centers, where they were honeycombed with streetcar tracks, out somewhere, like Rye Playland. And in a day when suburban housing development wasn't remotely what it is today, you can see that the building of those trolley lines out, in many cases, to somewhat isolated places, contributed to the filling up of the vacant and isolated land between the amusement park and the urban center. And it dramatizes to you how the trolley contributed to suburban development. I have shown you these pictures of these double-ended cars with the trolley on either end. The idea was that the trolley operating in some isolated place, when it came to the point where they just couldn't justify the trolley going any further, the trolley track just ended. And it had a car length of track by itself, but it had a switch. And again, it was either a passing track so the outbound car could meet the inbound car here, or it was just to turn the car around. It came, it went here, and then it went back on the single track, and maybe it had a passing track, 3 miles down the line to meet the next outbound car. That really didn't work, even with double-ended cars at a racetrack or an amusement park. Why? Because, say Saturday morning at the amusement park, everybody wanted to get on a trolley and go to the park. It was like a modern-day rush hour. You couldn't have one trolley pulling in here and another one here and going down, because you had 35 more cars coming here taking people to the amusement park. So this forced the trolley companies to do what they never liked to do. They had to buy real estate, or they had to work out a deal with the amusement park. Here is Rye Beach Park, the predecessor to the present Playland. They had to build a track, Midland Avenue, a portion of it to, I think it's Palisade, was called Meadow Street. There was a little street here, Beck Street. The trolley had to follow a convoluted route around to the amusement park property. It had to go in like this and have its own loop and double track. There was no other way to handle those kind of crowds. If you had 35 cars headed out here in the morning, those cars had to be able to come in and stop along the loop, and they'd pull in, all along the loop and let people out to go to the park. And the same thing was true of, say, a racetrack. Now, if you look at some old pictures of the pre-Lou Gehrig Yankees and the early days when Yankee Stadium opened, you'll find that they were forced in the city, the 3rd Avenue Railway, had to put extra tracks in the street. You had streets near Yankee Stadium with 3 and 4 tracks because they had so many cars arriving. People wanted to get there in time to watch the pitchers warm up. You had all that cluster of trolley cars, so that they had to make special provision, and they did. One of the things you can see is that I talked about the fact that the trolleys and the local politicians got into tremendous fights over paving between the rails. I told you that here in Mamaroneck, they're just a block down Mamaroneck from what was then the New Haven, they had their own land. When they had land, they were a taxpayer. They had to pay property tax. There was no special legal status for somebody engaged in transportation back in those days. And they argued about this when they started going bankrupt and when the automobile was really pushing them out of business. They made the kind of arguments you hear today in the Congress, where New York City wants money for the subways and AAA wants money for the interstate highway system and bridges. And they made all kinds of arguments about the fact that if the public authority builds a road for motor vehicle traffic, that's really a hidden subsidy. The trolley company buys a piece of private right-of-way, they have to pay taxes. And they did argue at great length about things like this. Now, I want to mention, again, going just a little bit out of Mamaroneck, what the overall transit picture was in southern Westchester. As I said to you, from Webster Avenue in the Bronx, on the Yonkers side. Webster coming up from the Bronx into Yonkers. For example, at 233rd, where Our Lady of Mercy Hospital is, there was eastbound trolley line. The trolley turned and went down Yonkers Avenue toward the racetrack over there in Yonkers. But here, for a brief period of time, you had to walk across the bridge to get on a trolley that went into downtown Mount Vernon. However, in Mount Vernon, you also had what we know today is the 241st Street subway line, elevated, and under that there were trolleys that came into Mount Vernon from the southwest. There were trolleys that came off of Eastchester Avenue and went down Pittman, P-I-T-M-A-N, near Mount St. Michael's High School, if some of you know where that is. And that, of course, became Sanford Boulevard. And somebody was talking to me before this formal part of the lecture about the fact that down on Sanford Boulevard in Mount Vernon, right before you got to the Pelham line, there was a highly specialized car barn there. It was a square brick building. It was built in the last days of the trolley lines. It was very modern. It only had 2 tracks entering the building, but what it had was pits where the electricians could go under the power trucks of the trolley and work on them from below. That was a very important part of the 3rd Avenue Railway's maintenance. And that building has only been torn down recently. Another thing I do when I'm not giving trolley lectures or babysitting is I coach a teenage girls' soccer team. And they have just built those 2 big domes like you have in your park here. One of those domes is the ice hutch for hockey. The other dome, believe it or not, is a golf driving range and soccer fields combined. You can hit a golf ball or you can play soccer in that other big dome down there. And that's right next to the land of the old trolley yards down there. If they had built those domes 70 years ago, the trolley company would have been delighted for the traffic that those would have generated. Those trolleys, because they were narrow gauge, and I'm not sure I made it clear, the trolley was always a more narrow gauged railway than, say, Metro North. Why? Because the streets in downtown Mount Vernon are old. Streets in downtown New Rochelle, some of them places where the trolleys maneuvered, had tight turning radiuses, so that the gauge of rail in the whole trolley system was always narrow. And they were pretty good. They were pretty agile, able to maneuver fairly long cars around fairly tight curves in places especially like Mount Vernon. But the cars came in there, then they went up to White Plains on Route 22, Columbus Avenue, and that was a single track where they had a pretty high volume of business, and they had a number of passing tracks. It was roughly 11 miles from the intersection of Lincoln and Columbus in Mount Vernon up to Main Street, which was then Railroad Avenue in White Plains. And they had to have a fairly sophisticated operation up Route 22. And they had turnoffs in Bronxville. The trolleys that came up North Avenue out of downtown New Rochelle bent on Mill Road. The intersection of Mill Road and Route 22 there in Eastchester, which I'm sure many of you know, it's very wide. If you've ever thought about why that's such a big intersection, it's because of the trolleys. The trolleys were not confined. They had sort of control when they laid the track there, and they didn't go for the tight curves. And that's one of the reasons to this day that that particular intersection is what we say sort of spacious, because the trolleys didn't confine themselves to tight maneuvering there. Now, to sort of tie all this together, I'd love to come back sometime and talk to you about the Westchester. What I've been talking to you about tonight are lightweight trolley cars providing very localized service that sort of supported the New Haven stops. Pelham, New Rochelle, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Harrison, Rye, Portchester. You came on a Class 1 railroad at a very great speed, at all times on private right-of-way. You got off, and then you paid a nickel for what was the equivalent of the taxi of its day. The trolley, operating on local streets, took you to your local destination. If you're a historian, you're a member of the Mamaroneck Historical Society, you know that it's easy to trace how the Westchester went through Mamaroneck. And what's your main clue as a historian to how the Westchester went through? The bridge abutments. Jefferson Avenue, Mamaroneck Avenue itself. You've got that little piece alongside the main Metro North. The main Metro North has still got rails and ballast and block signals and gantry to hold the overhead. But all along through Mamaroneck, right next, wherever you've got a railroad embankment for Metro North, you've got this ghostly appendage to it where the Westchester ran. And as I say, the Westchester even had an impact on street railways because they had such high standards. The station they built in Pelham is beautiful. It's gone. The station they built in Scarsdale, right at Heathcote Crossing, is the ambulance service there. Beautiful building. If you look at that building as a piece of architecture, those were people with very high standards. High standards in electrical engineering. They tried to have high standards in service, scheduling, rolling stock, everything. They were also nuts. The idea that you could support a railroad line from starting in Morris Park in the Bronx, that isn't bad going to White Plains maybe, but going to Boston to compete with the New Haven, it was always an unrealistic idea. They always predicated the idea that they could bring people into Morris Park who would ride the elevated, as it was back in those days, or the subway, or the trolleys to get where they wanted to go, and people just weren't willing to do that. The site of the present Galleria in White Plains is the site of the old White Plains terminal of the Westchester. As I say, I could talk to you about that at great length. I'd like to say a few words in closing about being a historian and sort of hunting for clues of the old trolley lines. There is in the New Rochelle Library, in the local history collection, the Bromley, B-R-O-M-L-E-Y, Atlas of Westchester County for the year 1910. Now, my assumption is that quite a few of you must be interested in historical subjects that relate to what was physically here in 1910. I can't recommend this book to you, this Atlas of Westchester County by the Bromley Company. They have in there the pages, the average page of a map is about this wide and about this high, and they are beautiful. As a trolley historian, I can look at that map and know where every switch, every siding, every one of these passing tracks I've been talking about is located. They're beautifully drawn. They have the names of the real estate companies that were promoting residential developments, you know, dividing tracts and selling land for houses. So if any of you have interest in an actual research project where you need this kind of information, New Rochelle has got the books for 1910, which was the golden age of the trolley that I like. They've got them for 1929, the start of the Depression, and it's shocking, if you're me, to see how many trolley lines were totally abandoned by 1929 at the start of the Depression, and then they've got them for more recent years. They have a new type of macadam for paving streets. It used to be, up to 5 or 10 years ago, that I could go as somebody who came to live in Westchester from far away. And by the way, I've ridden trolleys in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Tokyo and a lot of other places. You could tell, if you were interested in the trolleys, much of where they ran beyond looking at this beautiful map. The macadam mix that the tar companies, or whatever you call them, the paving contractors, used up to about 10 years ago, always fell prey to this fact I gave you a while ago, that the cities and towns did the paving gutter to gutter, but they left this to the trolley companies. Because after all, these were rails, and there were wooden ties buried in the ground to support those rails. And you'd be amazed how almost everywhere, once the trolley company was gone, maybe the rails were torn up at World War II and made into bullets and shot at the axis. But even so, years later, somebody like me interested in the trolleys could come along. Maybe this had been paved twice. There were always cracks in this macadam based on sinking, settling, whatever you want to call it, that for years we could see where the trolleys had been. Now, when I was preparing for this talk a couple of Sundays ago on the 6th of March, well, on the night of Saturday the 5th, I said to my wife, I got something special to do tomorrow morning. And my wife, being a wise woman, said, old goat, what are you up to? And what I was up to, of course, was getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning and coming down to the Mamaroneck Railroad Station and Halstead Avenue and that portion of Mamaroneck Avenue between Spencer Place and Halstead to see if I could find telltale curving cracks in the macadam to show me exactly where that trolley came up Mamaroneck Avenue and curved off onto private land so I could tell you all where to go. I now know from looking at the map today, this 1910 Bromley, that it's the first place to the left of the shoe store. That's where it came in. And it's also interesting that it didn't go all the way to Ward Place and come out on Halstead and Ward. They had their own right-of-way back in there. It came out right about where the liquor store is today on Halstead. That's where it popped back out onto Halstead. If you ever want to research railroads, there are a lot of good sources. The minutes of the little local governing bodies, and it's amazing. These ladies in these local libraries around here, the reference librarians, they're wonderful people. These old tax maps, particularly in the local history section of the New Rochelle Library, the records in Albany of the formation of railroad companies and the dissolution of them once the bus had knocked them out. There's a lot of clues that a person can look at and see. Now, getting ready for this, Filomena was nice enough to tell me about the member of your organization who donated all those little models that are up in the main room of the library. And I looked at those hoping to find a model of that trolley terminal. And unfortunately, although the ladies were very helpful in exposing me to those models you had, I couldn't find one of the station. So that's my summary of vanished technology, a different era when, as I say, you could go from here to Boston. As I say, you're drinking a beer on Mamaroneck Avenue. You didn't have to ride all the way out from Manhattan. I estimate that the cost from Mamaroneck to Boston by trolley, say in 1912, was about $1.25 in your case.
How long would it take?
Oh, it'd take the better part of a day. Because you see, there were certain points, like in Stamford, where you had to get off a trolley that had come through Greenwich, you know, originating in New Rochelle. And you'd have to wait. The service wasn't that good from Stamford to Hartford. You had to wait. Yeah, this was not the Orient Express with canapes served at 4 with your tea, that's for sure. This was the poor man's travel. Now, here comes a gentleman with the kind of map. This is exactly the kind of map.
That's in 1901.
This is 1901. Now, 1901, you see, yeah, that might do for horse car lines. But you see, for example, the Westchester didn't start buying real estate until after 1905. If you look at the 1910 Bromley map, quite a few of the plates show dashed lines on them, and it says proposed route of the Westchester. And it was proposed because the lawyers hadn't finished, you know, the title closings on all the real estate for the line. So now, having discussed a vanished technology with you all, I'm going to make an effort to shock you all to finish up by holding up here the New York Times National Report for Thursday, Veterans Day, November 11, 2004. What we call light rail today. It's not competing with automobiles and horse-drawn carriages in the streets. It's not inflexible. If there's a fire, they don't have to turn off the trolley wire because it's dangerous to the firemen going up ladders to the burning building. This is a brand new metropolitan light rail trolley system, inaugurated and building, adding to itself. Cucamonga, Timbuktu, somewhere out in the old Asian republics of the USSR. This is Denver, Colorado, home of Rocky Mountain High and the Denver Broncos and a few other potent organizations. People are realizing that if you give the trolley its turf in the urban setting, it will move people for you in rush hour better than anything. I don't know how many of you have been to a Yankee game lately. I go down there with grandkids. I go down there with women at home who say, that old man is spoiling his grandchildren. And I get down there and I have to pay $20 to park. And it takes you 15 minutes from the stadium to get back up onto the Grand Concourse. Now, you've got a subway that runs, and it lets people off on the upper level and down. But just suppose you had this kind of a trolley from Westchester that went down through Mount Vernon, and not the way Metro North goes, but cut over, sort of met the subway coming from the north, and let you get in and out of Yankee Stadium and back to Mamaroneck. Zero parking cost, zero time waiting for your car. You'd be interested in this. And so while the trolley is gone from the streets of Mamaroneck, there are people looking at it and reinstituting it. You can go by trolley from Southern California down to Tijuana, Mexico. You can go by trolley from Camden to Trenton now. You can go by trolley from Bayonne all the way up to Bergen County now. They have what they call the Bergen-Hudson Light Rail. So the trolley is sort of creeping back. It ain't dead. The mummy has escaped from the pyramid. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I want to leave you tonight with the thought that people are rejecting what I said when I started my talk. It's not a long-dead technology. It's a technology that in this age of congestion, people are looking at. Light sweet crude hit 55.60 in intraday trading today. That Lexus RX 330 don't look quite as good as it did this time last year. People are starting to ask basic questions about transportation. And I thought I'd end my talk by just showing you that you can look at the November 11 New York Times and ask yourself what the future holds. I want to thank you all for listening to me. As I say, stating my qualifications to give this talk, I want to emphasize that I changed diapers today, I do formula, I do all that good stuff. So that, and the name of the soccer team I coach is the Pink Piggies. So thank you very much.
You know when was the last time they ran a trolley on Mamaroneck Avenue?
I'll tell you what I know about that, and you can check it. It was around 1930, and it was with very bad will. People were up in arms because the trolley company was in trouble. Buses were running. Jitneys were running. The trolley company spent zero maintenance on overhead wire. Down on the post road by the nurseries, the run between the run into Larchmont from New Rochelle, they had cases, and I've seen the newspaper reports. The whole thing just came down. The stays on the poles gave way, and live 500-volt trolley wire came right down in the street on more than one occasion. So I know that the trolleys were gone from Mamaroneck, and the runs out of Mount Vernon were gone, and up Mamaroneck Avenue to White Plains. All of that was gone by the Depression. What hung on until after World War II was downtown New Rochelle. That was it. It's a sad story. I didn't want to burden you folks with a lot of specific dates, but that roughly is what went on. And the Westchester ceased running in 1935 amid battles between the bondholders and the railroad, the federal courts, bankruptcy people. As I say, I can show you land in Scarsdale. I could take you right now out of here and show you land that's worth $400,000 per building lot that's just got grass growing because it's still tied up in the bond issues of the Westchester.
What is the maximum speed of the trolleys there?
The maximum speed that a trolley was capable of didn't matter because the trolley by nature stopped and picked up your grandmother, and she was moving a little bit slow and got on, and then it accelerated up speed and went a block, but then it was decelerating the next block for the next trolley stop. The speed was very low, the average speed, in the urban setting. There was a trolley line in Ohio, where I grew up, the Cincinnati and Lake Erie Railway. They had a line that ran from Cincinnati through Dayton and Springfield to Columbus. They had another line west of that that went up to Toledo. As a stunt for the RKO Path A newsreels in the 1920s, RKO Path A chartered a biplane. And the biplane, flying at an altitude of about 1,000 feet above the track, was put in a measured mile race with some of the late technology. As I told you, I didn't speak about late technology of trolleys here because there never was any around Westchester. But those interurban lines fought hard to stay in business. They experimented with aluminum body cars, which was revolutionary in any kind of railroading. The RKO Path A news cameras were aimed on the airplane up here, and the Cincinnati and Lake Erie interurban trolley down here, which was running largely on private right-of-way leased from these farmers who gave them their milk in the morning. They did a measured mile of a race between a high-speed trolley and a biplane. And of course, the trolley company, you know what result the trolley company wanted for its advertising, but it really is true, the trolley won.
See, as far as the last trolleys in America, I rode on. The station was up on Bishop Place, right along the bank of the Metro North now. It ran up to Fenimore Road, up to Palmer Avenue, and when it got to Newer Shell, it went over to Fifth Avenue, up to North Avenue. That's when my father died when I was in 1922, and my mother and we used to go to the cemeteries quite often, and we rode it until it stopped. If we didn't ride on that, we rode on the Westchester and Boston in order to get to Newer Shell. But that's the last that ran, and that's where the station was. Bill, thank you very much for a very wholehearted, nice, bringing us back to the...
Okay, just remember that you got more little kids' hair to cut, that's all. Folks, thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate it. And just think, if he had hung on to that, because he bought that ad in the ballpark, he had stock in the Cincinnati Reds baseball club. He bought it for a few $100s, he sold it back. He thought he had enough advertising for his funeral parlor, he sold it back.